This House believes that governments should govern and not gamble. It is Ian Devine to plead the case to open the sequence of arguments for the proposition.
Let me begin by asking the question. Governments should govern and not gamble. What does governance mean? What is it to govern? Well, a good place to start is to look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition of governance. And if we look at that, it says that to govern is to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of a state, organisation, or people with authority. To govern, or to conduct, the policy and actions and affairs of a state. And when we think about that, and that definition, we realise that in fact, a government cannot govern, and certainly cannot govern effectively, unless it takes risks. Evidently, governments all over the world, every single day, take decisions that affect thousands, millions, sometimes billions of people. And doing that in itself means taking risks. For example, a government may choose to reduce taxes in order to increase growth in its economy, but the downside of that, the risk, might be that its own funds are cut. A government may choose to increase its power abroad and to try and increase its influence with other countries, but may find itself at the risk of getting involved in foreign entanglements or foreign wars as a result. Or a government may choose to open its borders to refugees from other countries to try and ease a humanitarian crisis abroad, but it would do so at the risk of undermining social cohesion within its own borders. So we can clearly see that governance, by its definition, involves taking risks. So that means, ladies and gentlemen, that we, on the proposition side tonight, are not going to stand here and try and defend this motion by saying government shouldn't take risks. That's not what we're going to try and do. We believe that fundamentally good governance involves taking risks, and we are all for that. But then, needless to say, the question becomes, what is the difference between a risk, which we think is a good thing that governments should do, and a gamble, which we think governments should not do? How are we drawing that line? How are we making those definitions? Well, we think that the fundamental difference between governments taking risks and taking gambles is in the amount of preparation and the kind of preparation that they do when they make a decision. Any decision that a government makes, any action that it makes, could be classed either as a risk or a gamble. But which of those categories it falls into depends very much on how much preparation it does before it makes a decision. You can think about this in terms of examples from daily life. For example, I may have to drive to work in the morning, and I will take the unavoidable risk that I may be hit by another car, I may get injured as a result, particularly if I'm driving in Calcutta. But that is a risk. It becomes a gamble when I don't do my seatbelt up. It's about the preparation. I may go skydiving on holiday, jump out of a plane from 35,000 feet. That's a risk. But it becomes a gamble when I don't check my parachute beforehand. So any action can be either a risk or a gamble, depending on the level of preparation that's gone into it. So how are we defining what makes for good preparation? Well, we on the proposition think that there are really three key aspects of good preparation, three things that make good preparation for a big decision. The first is that a government must consider the effects of their policies on the whole nation and not just part. A government must secondly act on all the information available to it and not neglect key pieces of information. And lastly, most importantly, a government must have a plan B, must have a backup plan for what happens if the desired course of action doesn't prove or doesn't provide the right result or doesn't give the right answers. And what we believe is that if a government prepares for a big decision by considering all of its population and the effects of its decisions on the whole population, if it makes decisions and prepares by thinking about all the information available to it, and if it has a plan B, a backup plan for the decisions that it's making, then it will be taking calculated risks rather than gambles. And that is the distinction that we are going to try and draw this evening. And that is why we believe that governments should govern and not gamble. Thank you very much.
And taking on Ian head-to-head is Shundip Chatterjee, who has the extra minute added on as 7 minutes, opening 5+2.
We have heard for years that the sun never set on the British Empire. The paradox is, when we went to Britain, we found that on most days it doesn't rise either. Mr. Chairman, sir, ladies and gentlemen, the argument and logic of the leader of the proposition, the difference between risk and gambling, without any reference to the word governance in the motion, seems to be as paradoxical as waiting for the British sunshine. You wait for it to happen, but it keeps you in the dark. Mr. Chairman, sir, our contention from this side is very clear. First of all, the motion has a word governance in addition to the word gambling. The motion says that governments should govern and not gamble. It doesn't say, the motion does not say, I reiterate, the government should take risks but not gamble. And the distinction is on the temporal time frame of preparation. I'm afraid, therefore, the topic seems to have completely eluded the proposition thus far. The question I'm going to ask you is, to remain in government, what is required? What is required is to be in power first. Then you are in government, then you can take up the act of governance. And what is the activity that you need to be indulging in to get into power? It is an activity which I would define as the process of procuring possession of a position of power, an activity which goes by the pseudonym of contemporary politics. So in other words, it is our contention from this side that you have to first perform an act of gambling, which is of course the definition of contemporary politics, before you can reach and get elevated to a position of power, which is of course called government, and then you can get to the act of governance. Whether you call it with preparation or without preparation is irrelevant. If I tell you, strategizing, calculating, taking odds into account, with the sole intent of self-propagation and self-preservation to remain in power, is the definition of an activity, you will say that's the definition of politics. Strangely, that's the definition the concise Oxford Dictionary has of the word gambling as well. And in many ways, politics today is the same as gambling. And that's the activity you need to do to get into power and be called government before you get into the act of what is called governance. That, ladies and gentlemen, is our first contention from this side. Without the act of political gambling, you don't get into power, you don't become government, and therefore you cannot govern. Let's look at contemporary world politics today. A man on the west of the Atlantic decides in WWF style, and he's familiar with that style, to throw and assault all norms of social justice and racial equality propounded by people like Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson. He promises a gamble of building a wall around the southern perimeter of his country to throw out his friendly southern neighbors. He doesn't adopt principles. He doesn't have a huge amount of preparation of the parachute, but he gets elected to what arguably is the most powerful position on this planet. And he gets into that government with this gamble, and this gamble allows him now to govern for the next few years. That is our contention from this side of the floor. But it is more than that. On the other side of the Atlantic, a not so lucky man takes a decision which makes his country exit from the European Union and makes him exit from the Prime Minister's office. This is called a gamble. Had he succeeded, and had he won the referendum, it would have been called an act of great governance. So what we're trying to say, and this is our second contention from this side of the floor, that gambling and governance are two different attitudes of looking at the same action. In other words, what today appears as an act of gambling may in future be written in history books as an act of great governance. Gambling and governance are separated by the Einstein frame of time. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it was considered an act of gambling, but he became somebody who allowed good governance for a long time. Closer to home, a firebrand lady decided one day that she's going to throw out of the state an automobile manufacturer who could have made a difference to our financial status. That was a gamble. When she gets elected to the highest office in the state for the second time, we say that's good governance. That, ladies and gentlemen, is our second contention from this side of the floor. Governance and gambling are just two different perspectives of looking at the same action, depending on whether you've succeeded or not. And governments, therefore, necessarily will have to gamble before they can have good governance. But let's look at the motion in a broader perspective. All of us live by gambling. In the social sphere, the way we bring up our children, the ethics, the education, the principles we instill into them is social gambling. When it succeeds, we say it's parental good governance. When it fails, we say it's a gambling that failed. In the world of finance, the whole world of finance revolves around gambling. When you make an investment, you may get an interest, you may lose your deposit, or half an hour later, the Prime Minister may come on air and say that all fixed deposits have been abolished from midnight to night. In the world of biology, the whole world of living beings thrives on gambling. When a cell changes for the worse, we say the individual has got cancer. When the cell changes for the better, we say it is evolution. Evolution and cancer are biological gambles and biological governance. So in summary, Mr. Chairman, sir, what me and my team are going to say from this side of the floor are simply this. Number one, you need to gamble to get into power of governance, to get into a government so that you can govern. So gambling is necessity before you become a government, and you have to be a government before you can govern. Secondly, gambling and governance are two ways of looking at the same coin, the two sides of the same coin. When it's successful, we say it's good governance. When it fails, we say it's good gambling. Nothing to do with preparation, something to do with the result that you achieve. And finally, in the social sphere, in the economic sphere, and in the world of living biology, we thrive on gambling. It is gambles that leads us to governance. Thank you very much.
With a rather strong, where Shundip did not mince his words at all, and with the current state of impasse in the Indian Parliament, probably casinos would have functioned better. So that is the next fundamental legislation that the Constitution can consider. And taking on Shundip Chatterjee will be Cameo Choker. Cameo, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, tonight what I want to talk to you about is legitimacy, which is what Ian just touched on earlier. But before I do that, I want to address a few things that Sandeep just touched on. He said that you have to get into a position of power before you can govern. But some things matter more than just getting into power, like governing with legitimacy. He also brought up that you have to gamble in finance and in investment. But I don't know anyone who invests in something with something that they're not prepared to lose. If you invest $1,000, you better be willing to lose that $1,000. So I hope I don't make your ears bleed, but I am going to use the examples of Brexit to legitimize my case, as well as the case of Canada. And I'm going to talk about how in the UK they gambled and how in Canada they govern. So what does it mean? What does it look like when a government has legitimacy? It means that it has the backing of its people. It has the support of its citizens. It has the confidence of its citizens. And why is this important? As Sandeep said, governments have power and they have authority. But they don't have those things if they don't have legitimacy. And they need the people's support for that legitimacy. So let's look at the United Kingdom. Last year we had a general election, and the Conservative Party won that election on the coattails of having a referendum. And that's fine, that's a good thing. The people need to be heard. But unfortunately, the way that this was gone about was that the referendum was put in place before we knew what we were betting on. David Cameron promised a referendum before he was negotiating with Brussels, and that's a problem because this undermines the legitimacy. He was unprepared for the outcomes that we know today. He was so blinded, he was so convinced that we were going to win, and he bluffed just like a gambler would. He said that no matter what the outcome was, he would stay as prime minister. And you know what happened the morning of? While we were all having breakfast, he rolled out of bed and he quit. Because he knew he couldn't go forward. He knew that because he had bluffed, because he had laid all the cards on the table, and now he didn't have a plan B, he wasn't prepared, that he no longer had the support of the country behind him. And what are the consequences of this? You saw the entire country rip itself apart down the middle, 52 to 48. And not only that, you saw the parties rip itself apart. You saw a leadership race where friends and leaders went against each other and stabbed each other in the back. They made their party members not trust them anymore. They made the public not trust them anymore. They lost the confidence, not only of their party, but of the country. And now what do we have? We have a prime minister who actually campaigned to remain. We have a prime minister who was not elected. We have a cabinet that was not elected. We have a government that was not elected by the people. This makes it lose its legitimacy. So let's jump across the pond. Let's look to see what good governing looks like. Let's look to Canada. Now, a year ago today, Canada accepted over 30,000 Syrian refugees. Now, this is a huge risk. If you look to other countries like Germany and France, you see that the problems that are arising with huge influxes of these refugees. These are people from a different country, a different culture, and these things can clash. So why is it working out so well in Canada? What's going on over there? Well, the government is mitigating those risks. They've provided a framework for why this works. They've put trust into its citizens. In Canada, Syrian refugees can be sponsored by the government or privately. The government sponsors them for a year, helps them with language classes, on how to print out a resume, and helps them find jobs. But this is also done privately. This is done by nonprofits, by businesses, and more importantly, it's done by communities. People turn to their neighbor and they say, hey, I think this is a really good thing. I think this is going to work out. And they work together to help bring in those refugees and support them and integrate them. They're not just immigrants, they're new Canadians. So why has this worked out so well? Because the government trusts its citizens, and its citizens trust the government. And that support is what makes the government have legitimacy. So tonight I've talked to you a little bit about what gambling looks like, what it's like to not be prepared, to let things fall apart in the UK with Brexit. And I've talked a little bit about how governing works when you mitigate those risks and how successful it can be. So governments should govern and not gamble, and I urge you to side with our motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameo. And taking on Cameo is Swati Gautam.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you for coming here to listen to us. A very warm welcome to my friends from Great Britain. perhaps the only nation in the world that has greatness prefixed to itself. And this greatness, ladies and gentlemen, was not brought about by any careful governance or planned execution and implementation. This, ladies and gentlemen, was the result of very bold gambles, both by the government and the people of Britain. They gambled away to distant shores, faraway lands, hot, humid, and marshy, alien cultures, alien people, alien cuisine, alien conditions, alien climate, and probably even alien disease. That led them to greatness, ladies and gentlemen. The point I'm trying to make is this. As I take on the agenda set by my team leader, I'm here to carefully dissect and present before you the distinction between the negative connotation of gambling and the way good governance usurps these sweet fruits of gamble. What goes right is great planning. What goes wrong was a gamble. And what we do not realize, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Life on earth itself is a gamble. But before I go on to that, I have a request to make of you. As I try and bust the myth that this motion is, I request you to please be fair and think about this. Why is it that we have allocated, offered, attached this negative connotation to a gamble? A gamble, ladies and gentlemen, is distinctly different from a wager or a bet. A gamble, taken in its larger entire perspective, is not knowing the outcome of an action. A gamble is an apprehension of a tomorrow. A gamble is uncertainty. A gamble is being unsure. And yet, a gamble has been made to shoulder the burden of all bad governance. Let's keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that there's a very fine but firm line dividing a wager and a bet from a gamble. I request you, please, to keep yourself, your minds, your eclectic thinking open and do not blur the line between the two. Ladies and gentlemen, they say the vagaries of nature are uncertain. If nature itself is uncertain, naturally so is life on earth. Governments do not descend from the moon. Governments comprise of men and women like you and me, of people like you and me, perhaps not of humans like you and me, but certainly of men and women like you and me. They don't comprise of saints and seers who can foretell a tomorrow and who know what a tomorrow will get. How in heavens can we even pretend to think that a government actually governs? Isn't that a misnomer? Isn't that a fraud in our thinking? Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to quickly run you through some gambles gone bad and some gambles that turn to good governance. The birth of the Indian National Congress. After a century of utter loot, mayhem, barbaric inhumanism, the colonial rulers realized that there was time to create a platform through which the Indians could vent their discontent in a rather civil manner, and so the INC was born. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a bad gamble. Because this half-naked fakir, on his way back to his country from South Africa, converted and used this very platform to galvanize and catalyze the anger of the people of India and throw the British out. A gamble gone wrong remains a gamble. Cut to 100 years later, and the then Indian government in the 1980s decided very thoughtfully, I'm being sarcastic here, please, and let me point that out, decided to actually indulge in automobile manufacturing, in manufacturing cars. And least prepared as they were for it, they paid no heed and they decided to go on and manufacture cars. That paid off, ladies and gentlemen. That changed the way India travels today. It changed the face of India as Maruti was born. That gamble turned out to be great governance. Ladies and gentlemen, very quickly. Just yesterday, so say the newspapers, 2 cats have been employed by the UK cabinet to catch mice at Downing Street. If they don't, that's a gamble. If they do, that's great vision, great governance. Ladies and gentlemen, let me quickly go back to serious things. Ancient Indian wisdom, the sagacity of Pitama Bhishma when he speaks to Dharmaraj Yudhishthir about Raj Dharma, about good governance. And here is what he says. Nirdhananam dhanam vyapter, dhanikanam adhikam dhanam, bruvanam sarvatha grahya, loke jyotisha katara. He clearly says the government must be like an astrologer that says the poor will be rich tomorrow and the rich richer still. Because people like to hear what is convenient and acceptable to them, ladies and gentlemen. Does the government have any other option but to gamble? Do we all have any other option but to gamble with our lives on earth? Let not the proposition contain you to their very narrow interpretation of gambling. Let not a dictionary hold back your eclectic thinking and your wisdom, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing is certain. Not the outcome of love making, nor the outcome of the choices we make in love. I hope to bolster my argument with this final melodious point. In this evergreen and everlasting melody, too, lies the universal truth of nothing and nothing at all being certain. When I was just a little girl, I asked my mother, what will I be? Will I be pretty? Will I be rich? Here's what she said to me. Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see. The future's not ours to see. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. Thank you.
Swati, well done. We have the pleading from a barrister in making, Kokila. Kokila, take her on.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Government is responsible primarily for making public policy for the entire society. It's a steering mechanism that keeps society heading in the right direction. Gambling for political maneuver undermines the government's ability to govern as it places party gains over the welfare of society as a whole. There is a difference between gambling and calculated risk. Good preparation makes one consistent with governing and the other not. What is good preparation? Well, it involves assessing the risk for the whole population and ensuring that you're acting on all information available at hand. And it's also having a plan B to make sure that the most vulnerable in society are taken care of. Demonetization is a gamble, and it's not a calculated risk. We can all accept that the black marketeers with their ill-gotten black money stored in stacks of banknotes should get their just desserts. Those who cannot justify their source of wealth should face punitive charges. While the idea is fantastic, the plan is flawed, and it fails to satisfy the criteria that we've outlined as what constitutes of a good preparation. Banknotes, they're not just a way for the rich to store their wealth, but it's also the way the unbanked survive. So what did the government do? Did they look at how the policy of demonetization will affect the society as a whole? Let's look at the facts. Indian economy simply runs on cash. 90 to 98% of transactions in India use cash. So it's a lack of forethought that resulted in what we're witnessing as mayhem. So if you're going to demonetize a 1,000 rupee note, you may as well release a 2,000 rupee note of the same size. And at the very least, even smaller than the current 100 rupee note. And it's the recalibration process would have been made easier if these changes were implemented. So firstly, India is not the first country to introduce an abrupt and drastic reform of its currency. Burma, they did it in 1987. Soviet Union did it in 1991. North Korea did it in 2009. And the results, they're not very encouraging. In Burma, there was a revolt. Soviet Union disintegrated, and the North Koreans went hungry. Is this really what Mr. Modi had in mind for the Indian population? Secondly, let's look at agriculture. That accounts for 15% of India's GDP, and it's heavily reliant on cash. So most of the payments for things like seeds, fertilizers, laborers' fees are all carried out in cash. So implementing demonetization right in the middle of Indian farmers harvesting the Kharif crops will cripple the farmers and the Indian rural economy. And finally, 4 out of 5 Indian workers are in the informal sectors. They're paid by cash. So removing 86% of cash in circulation would lead to workers being laid off as employers cannot pay them. So the last criteria I'm going to look at is, did the government safeguard the most vulnerable in society? Well, at the Mandis, sales, transport, and distribution of agriculture products are almost entirely dependent on cash. So not only has the RBI banned exchange of old banknotes at the cooperative banks, which are used by the farmers frequently, they've also failed to supply no new cash at all to India's hundreds of smaller rural cooperative banks or their agriculture credit unions. So there's no cash flow for the farmers. They cannot seek help from the informal channels that they normally rely on. So what's happening is that the result is that India's rural economy is seizing up. Farmers are finding it really, really tough. So even though this was a calculated risk and it did not pay off, adequate preparation enabled the government to be insulated from failure. There is a difference between gambling and calculated risk, and that is preparation, preparation, and preparation.
Pradeep, your take on demonetization. I think you've got a job on your hands.
Mr. Chairman, sir, members of the House, there are 2 teams from the United Kingdom currently touring India, 2 teams of eminence. One, of course, is on the stage with us. The other one was playing cricket in Wankhede in Bombay. I'm sorry, guys, both the teams are having a bad time. If you were watching the cricket, as I was for most of the day and not preparing for this debate, England still has to get 49 runs, and they have only 4 wickets in hand to avoid an innings defeat. The performance of our earlier speakers do not inspire confidence. If the cricketers played like them, they would be in deep trouble. Nothing personal, just a comment, It's just a bad time of the year for you, I guess. We are here to tell you today that governments should gamble rather than just govern. One of the greatest gambles in the history of India was by a gentleman called Subhash Chandra Bose. Many of our visitors may not have heard his name. He took a great gamble to escape from his residence in Calcutta, crossed all of continental Asia and all of continental Europe, landed up in the continent of Europe in the city of Berlin, took a submarine ride under the Atlantic Ocean through the Indian Ocean, went to Southeast Asia, formed the Indian National Army. That army then marched through the passes between India and Burma, now Myanmar. That army lost the battle. Mr. Bose lost his life. He took a gamble, he lost, but India won. The INA trials caused the British Indian Army to rise up in arms and persuaded the British government to beat a precipitate retreat from Indian shores. Gambles, even when they fail, win. The purpose of governance is to understand the mindset of the constituent, the people of that country. Every aspect of government has to take a gamble. We've gambled. Sometimes governments fail in their gamble. Neville Chamberlain took this famous gamble with Adolf Hitler, failed. The Second World War happened. But without that failure, Hitler would have been a great leader of a great nation, purer than driven snow, had he not been exposed by that gamble as a bloodthirsty psychopath. Similarly, in India, we've gambled. We've tried to improve relationships with our neighbors with gamble. One of the prime ministers that I admired the most, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, took this massive gamble to improve relationships with our Western neighbor. It failed. But nonetheless, if you want to be remembered in history, you have to gamble. You cannot be a stick in the mud. Neither a stick nor the mud is glamorous. Nobody remembers you if you stay a stick in the mud. There are, of course, exceptions to gambling. Gambling, contrary to the negative perception that has sought to be portrayed by the proposition, gambling does operate within a framework. In a democracy, it operates within a parliamentary framework. The famous incident of gambling in the Mahabharata operated within the rules of gambling, and I will conclude my speech with that. If you remember the gambling scene in the Mahabharata, here is a king who gambles away his kingdom, his brothers, himself, his clothes, his jewelry, and finally his wife. And yet he rides on a chariot that rides 4 inches above the ground because his virtue is not diminished, because he was honest about his gambling. So the real alarm bell for government is to be honest and truthful about what it does, whether it is gambling or whether it is stick in the mud governance. That is the point we are trying to say. What we are saying is that governments need to be honest, but there should be no reason why governments should not gamble. Now, before the chairman starts off with his regime of fines, I think I'll clear the stage. Thank you.
Pradeep, you've definitely amply clarified gambling from the point of view of the mythological perspective and the not so mythological perspective. But one thing you did not clarify is your relationship with your spouse. Was it a risk or a gamble? Or both? I think that will perhaps be clarified during the course of the summing up. And with that note of suspense from Pradeep, who very skillfully skirted around the financial aspects of his proposition, of his opposition, we come to Alexandra Spencer.
Good evening, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, charming opponents. Very charming, so charming I'm almost, well, do you not feel like you're lulled into a sense of security? Gambling. Well, let's go back to our definition of what really it means to gamble. From what they're saying, I think they're saying you can take bold risks. Gamble's something slightly different. Now, all of us here, we are governed. We have a government right now. And that government has an influence in our everyday lives, our personal security, our safety. And these are things that we cannot take for granted. And these people who govern us, our government, we don't necessarily know them, but they make very big decisions on our behalf. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, are you satisfied with them playing poker with your safety and well-being without a backup plan if they do not get what they want? When our government decides that they are above our rule of law, this is when issues start to arise that says, well, I can get away with it, I can decide your future, and you do as I say and I don't do as I do. And that is a crisis in leadership. Currently, the president of the Philippines right now, Rodrigo Duterte, he right now has decided that for his own great outcomes, again, it could work, it could not, but he's decided that he is going to gamble, he's going to play poker with the rights, the human rights of his people. When he came into election just earlier this year, he decided that to save the future of his country, there has to be a crackdown on drugs. Drugs have to go, drug dealers have to go. But rather than going through the rule of law to do this, he said at all costs, the costs of the rights of civilians. If you wish to commit extrajudicial killings to get rid of these people, you have my permission. If citizens refuse the right to be arrested, the police have the right to kill them. This is a massive gamble for what may or may not work. And the problem with this is that a leader, rather than going through due process and finding a legal way to do it, has gone, I am above the legal system of which all of you have to abide by. And what precedent does that set? Maybe you agree drug dealers are bad inherent people. And if they're going to take a big risk, it shouldn't be with such large aspects of our life like human rights and national security. I implore you, Side with our side in the motion. This is your life here. And if a gamble doesn't pay off and you are the ones that they suddenly decide they don't like anymore and you do not have their rights, I wouldn't want a government like that, and I know you wouldn't either. So please side with our side of the motion. Thank you.
Now, on that note, a person who has an entire grip on what governance is about at the Minister for Heavy Industries and Public Enterprise, the atmosphere can be heavy, but we don't see a lot by way of industries. But in spite of the fact, the ministers for heavy industries and public enterprise, Babul Supriyo, who has to take all the trouble, even on competitive terms, to inaugurate a public highway, has taken all the trouble to be with us. Babul, thank you very much. Your take between governance and gambling.
Thank you, Kunalji, Kunal Dada, for making it so clear that you're batting for them. Uh, I'm like in a nice green lawn. I just wanted to get my shawl right in the place because I think I'm in good company. The mention of the highway also makes me feel that when you are in the highway of politics, you are going to see a few roadblocks. But then the question is whether you get the roadblocks to block you or challenge you to new horizons rather. So it's the way you want to take it. And I would like to take demonetization in the way the word is said and not the way a few of my colleagues have put it. I would just request you, we have just tried to demonetize, do not demonetize it. So there are a lot of good things hidden in what the government tried to do. And while time will slowly unveil what lies beneath, because most people think that there are a lot of things that lies beneath which is not meeting your eye right now. What meets my eye right now is a small bit of humor. The bank there says Dena Bank. I'm sure many people around the bank would say Dena Bank, please. Aaj mat khade kar itne der tak. It's a bad joke, but you can take it because what I found many of my colleagues from the other side, many of my friends from the other side say was more humorous than it made sense, especially given the fact that I am here to actually support the fact that when there is no risk, there is no gain. You can definitely, Indians, we have gone through a lot. History stands proof to that rather. For short-term pain, we are definitely going through short-term pain, but we have always achieved long-term gain when we have accepted short-term pain. And the facts and figures from around the country does say that the mass has amassed support around our PM. It is for time to decide whether the PMMs of both the countries, England and India, which one is facing Brexit, it's your problem. We are facing demonetization. I say PMM because there it is PM May and here it is PM Modi. So PMM is a better way to give it through. What I really mean is, what do you do? What do you do if you do not take risks? You let your mind get governed with those frightful things which takes your eyes away from the goal, right? And when you talk about goal, I would definitely say that there are many here who are saying that the government is shifting the goalpost. I would tell you one thing, and for sure, is that when you're shifting goalposts, you're just giving in the signal that we are in for seditions, we are accepting whatever is coming to us as teething problems in your daily life, and that's why we are addressing and tweaking the way the demonetization is being taken forward in day-to-day life, and that's why today Shaktikant Das is probably a more household name than Kapil Sharma. So the humility of the government and the lack of rigidity to stick to a decision, which obviously comes from confidence. At one point of time, Napoleon Bonaparte said that confidence is the first requisite to great undertakings. I would say that in today's world, where you are facing fierce competition and opposition, where opposition has taken the term opposition so very seriously that it has invented another term, which is probably oppositionism. If you're in the opposition, you just don't hear. You just keep on saying, so the opponent cannot come up with the logic to your answers or cannot answer to the questions because you're so scared that if I answer to your questions, the rest 15% I'm talking about the 85% data that is supposed to be with you is probably also going to be with the government. So what I definitely mean to say is that what would the government do? I mean, we talk about great car companies recalling cars, and that's in millions. Sometimes they recall for small problems in fuses, small problem in some kind of steering technology. It could be anything. So what do the government? That is fine, because that probably causes a lot of hardship to the families who take those cars and use them for the daily course. But it might save a life because you do not want a defective car. And similarly, what does the government do when it finds out that our economy is getting jeopardized by black money or fake currency, which is not only aiding terrorism, but is also making the rich even more richer with the wrong kind of currency, and the poor even more poorer, because they are neither close to cash and neither they are close to plastic, which should be a way forward for this country. We are trying for direct benefit transfers. Yes, I am speaking for the government. I am speaking for my government. We are trying direct benefit transfer to those Jan Dhan accounts because we want to actually demonetize the people who are playing middlemen and not allowing the money paid by the government reach those people. So it is a long process. When you're trying to do something hard, the hardships are going to be harder. But the point is, are we right? Are we walking in the right direction? To me, yes. To the people who do not want to believe and want to speculate, knowing the fact that speculation is something that a person can afford to do in only two situations. One, when you can afford to do it. The other one is when you cannot afford to do it. So at this point of time, I would request everyone to keep your mind and heart open and try to help the government, achieve what should be the goal of a country with 130 billion people. We are talking whether government should govern and not gamble when arguably the most powerful person in the world is someone who probably owns the biggest number of casinos in the world. Don't you think that is funny? Mr. Donald Trump probably gave us the biggest of casinos, where gambling is the prime thing that we do. And I'm sure we have many friends in this particular audience who have lost quite some money in going to those casinos. It does ring a bell in my heart. It does ring a bell in your heart. I think that if you go out, I'll just one thing. I don't mind paying him a little cash for a few extra minutes, because I think I'll make a few great points at the end of it. We are trying for a cashless economy. I don't want to be cashless here. I would do that honors for you. But just one last thing. I was reading a statement while I was driving back from Asansol to come to this place, and this is a point made by uh, Mr. Chris Williamson. Mr. Chris Williamson is the chief economist at Market, which compiled the data which says that the big question is where we go from here. Obviously, he's talking about Brexit, not for India. The big question is where do we go from here? There are firms saying that they have had contracts lost, cancelled, new orders not coming in anymore, which is predominantly linked to Brexit uncertainty. Go out on the streets, you can ask anyone. I mean, you can ask Didi, the Honorable Chief Minister, here about the demons that demonetization has actually released in the market. You're going to probably find us say the same things. That the big question is, where do we go from here? There are firms saying that they have lost contracts. They have cancelled new orders. They have nothing to look forward to. But history in India has always stand proof to the fact that the politicians have loved themselves more than the poor. So I will take one other cue from the noise that is being generated by the opposition. I would wait for some time. I'm still not the minister who could do that. I would wait for some time, because to me, the more noise, the more hurt. The more hurt, the more black money you may have kept stashed at homes, which you cannot use anymore. And therefore, wait for some time and then get a raid done. You could still be cashless, because that cash is not going to be of any use, but you would still find out who are the actual honest people who are trying to take forward this country forward along with their very honest Prime Minister. And let me tell you, confidence is something that emanates from honesty. And I think this is a very, very honest move. Let us all embrace the pain, because India has stood proof to the fact that we have always taken the initial pain and to be independent of ourselves in the future. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Babul, thank you very much. And I don't think it came as a surprise to any one of us that Babul agrees wholeheartedly with the Prime Minister, and that cannot be said the same of the Chief Minister. of the state he's in. Now, let's see how far our
Well,
differences...
sir, can I intervene?
And yes,
We'll just a rule number one that I follow, that
What?
that the boss is always right.
Is it?
And when
even you say that even when you are in Calcutta.
well, you can be in Kolkata, but you can have different bosses. You
Right.
can have different bosses. And when your boss is wrong,
Yeah.
I don't refer to rule number 2, but I would say that no risk, no gain. That is the rule I would follow.
You could have said that when you flew out yesterday morning. But being in Kolkata, and please remember to choose the right bosses, at least that we remind ourselves every day.
I normally boss around with the bosses. So let me carry on that till 2021.
Thank you, Babu. Thank you very much. Now, the last speaker for the proposition, Tony.
I want to open with a few points of rebuttal, if I may. Now, starting with our previous speaker, Babul. He asserted, as I fully expected him to assert, that we oppose taking risk of all sorts. What we've been talking about is what makes a risk acceptable. And what makes a risk acceptable is by deciding whether the decision to take that risk is in accordance with the principles of governance that we've been talking about, of legitimacy from Cameo, of welfare from Kokila, and of the rule of law from Ali. Shandip, in his opening gambit, mentioned that you have to gamble to get into power so you can govern. He neglected, of course, to mention at what cost and to whom, but that's not even the problem with that comment. The problem here is that it doesn't follow that you should have to continue gambling once you do get into government unless your sole priority is to stay in power, which is exactly the kind of opportunism that we feel is a threat to a thriving modern democracy like India's and like Britain's. Swati told us of how some of the greatest achievements have been gambles. We should remind her, of course, that so have some of the greatest failures in history. The real question she needed to answer but didn't was, how do you decide if your successes justify your failures? Furthermore, even if gambles do pay off, would you want them to if you had to violate all your principles in the process? Pradeep told us about how the purpose of governance is to deliver the greatest good to the greatest number, the classic utilitarian view pioneered by John Stuart Mill. Now, I put this to him. On June 23rd, 52% of the people who voted in the Brexit referendum decided that I, as someone who voted to remain, should be deprived of my rights as an EU citizen. If they also decided that I should be deprived of my right to love whom I choose, or to go where I please, should they be allowed to decide that for me? Or are there some incontrovertible rights that I have that are intrinsic to my being, that I expect my government to protect, that are beyond the reach of simply appealing to the greatest good to the greatest number, which is exactly what Shandip proposed we do in order to get into power? But that's all besides the point, if I'm not able to explain to you exactly why this debate matters in the first place. So let me give you a clue, ladies and gentlemen. A very interesting quote I read recently, a gentleman named Alex Wellerstein, a historian of nuclear weapons. He wrote, "I keep getting asked, are there any checks in place to keep the US president from starting a nuclear war?" After explaining to all the people who wrote to him that it is precisely the point of this system to give the president that control over who decides over whether a country, in this case the United States, goes to nuclear war, he said this: "The election is meant to be that check. Don't elect people you don't trust with the unilateral authority to use nuclear weapons if you're worried about that." So, ladies and gentlemen, the question here before us is, if we are so concerned about the principles of governance, who is responsible for making sure that our governments do adhere to those principles and don't just pursue power at any cost, as the opposition has proposed? The simple answer is, ladies and gentlemen, we are. We have a privilege and honor of being citizens of democracies, something that many countries in this world cannot say. And we choose our own leaders. We decide whether our leaders are going to gamble away our rights in order to stay in power, or whether they're going to govern responsibly in accordance with the principles that we have set out, even if a gamble can be shown to pay off and deliver on its objective. But this isn't just a right, ladies and gentlemen. This choice, this ability to pick our own leaders, is not just a right. It is a duty, a moral duty of each and every one of us, and now more so than any other. We have a crisis in leadership, precisely because we are ruled by gamblers, not governors, at this moment in time. So, my final challenge to you, ladies and gentlemen, as citizens who have a vision of the world you want to live in, a voice that you can use to express it, and a vote to hold your leaders accountable, is make your vision clear, make your voice heard, make your voice count. I beg you to pose the motion. Thank you.
And following Tony would be Shumanda, Professor Shuman Mukherjee, as the last speaker for the opposition.
Rather late in the day, that I should ask you to look into the topic and kindly note that the topic reads, the government should govern and not gamble. The word should is a moral verb. It is a value judgment. It is a prescription. It tells us what we ought to do. It tells us what we ought to do. But the point is, it is for us to accept that prescription. So this is not quite a motion that stands, because it's not even a motion. It's just a suggestion. And I thank them for the suggestion, but it's for us to accept whether we want to accept it. Let's go back to history. The Old Testament, if you like. Let's look at Moses, who threw down the tablets to give us the 10 Commandments. 3 critical shalls will be read out now. Thou shalt not murder. And we have learned from the West that we will declare war to have peace. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Clinton, did you hear? Profumo, what happened to Moses? Thou shalt not steal. We've had the British colonizing half the world to say it's good for you. We've come a whole circle now, and we are talking about we are not interested in avoiding risks, but we are talking about anticipated risks, bold risks, risks with a plan, plan B. I'd like to know what was the plan B of the Western world when they drop an atom bomb on Hiroshima. What was the plan B when they set out Titanic? Was there any plan B to see that the survivors are lifted? Yes, they had a few lifeboats, of course. What was the plan B when he had a foot and mouth disease? What was the plan B when one after the other we've seen governments falling where overtly and covertly they've had a hand in dropping them? We had somebody else coming up, the second speaker, Cameo, who says, it's all about getting into power. Yes, it's all about getting into power. But the power is not through democracy, which says of the people, by the people, for the people. It's of the people, by the people, for few people. And it's not about voting. It's about counting. And that's gambling. In an unfree world, to talk about absolute freedom is proposing rebellion. Gandhi told us to be free is also to be allowed to make mistakes. We should have the freedom to make mistakes. It's the effort that makes. I think the grounding of economics calls for a taking today, because most of them avoided the whole story that life is based on uncertainty. When we first taught economic logic by Dr. Sen, he did tell us that the whole purpose of growth, development, governance, if you like, is based on the basic axiom of believing that life is better than death. But if you want certainty, then you should be planning for death. and we are all planning for a better life. So what is the plan B for death? Do we have one? The plan B for death would be, how would you be remembered after you leave the world? So all your actions should be, what have I done in this world, so that the next generation remembers me for what I have done. You may have an Adolf Hitler, you might have a Swami Vivekananda, you might have a Mother Teresa, you might have Gautam Buddha, you might have Dalai Lama. The choice is yours. We've had the third speaker telling us about, oh, India has an agricultural sector where most people handle cash. My retort to her would be, is that true about UK? Most of the people handle cash in agriculture in USA, in UK. No, it isn't. Tell me another country where 85% of your currency is in cash, of your money in circulation is in cash. You say, we don't have that. So we are trying to put it back. That's the kind of bold risk we are taking in this country. If you don't have it in your country, isn't it time India does that? If you have an informal sector which is 40% outside the banking sector, isn't it time we got them into the banking sector? If you have most of the people still ruling the roost by just buying money with what they have in their wallets, isn't it time we taught them banking and the use of credit cards? Do they not use it? So why is this bad governance? We've had Tony telling us about acceptability of risks. My question would be a series of 5 questions to him. And that is precisely, why are laws amended? Why do politicians defect? Why do we have judiciary passing a judgment and we go for appeal from the lower court to the higher court to the Supreme Court, and for clemency we go to the president? Who told you decisions are perfect? Who told you in an asymmetric world there is no need for perfection? So when you are making a choice under uncertainty, you'll have to go for probabilities. You will have to make decisions under a distributional panel where the effective guess should be to make it best. You wouldn't have the world of insurance without it. You wouldn't have the stock market without it. You wouldn't have the capital market without it. And then what are you talking about? Governance without gambling. For heaven's sake, what had happened to America? Why was there meltdown taking place? Good governance? Or was it conceit? Was it deliberately done to ruin a few countries? Brexit? And that's my final challenge to them. What is the plan B for Muslims entering Europe, where by 2050 you will have the largest population in Europe of a Muslim-dominated state? Are you bargaining for that? So let's hear how you get out of this gamble.
Shravanda, strong as ever. That brings us to the round of interjections.
Good evening. I'm Ananta Bhattacharjee from the Department of Law, Calcutta University, and my question is to Mr. Sandeep Chatterjee. How do
You question to the team, they will choose who will answer.
how do you justify gambling involving the lives of ordinary citizens just to stay in power?
We do not justify gambling. We say gambling is a necessity to ascend into the seat of governance. And you need to be in the seat of governance before you can govern. You can hardly be in the opposition and say you want to demonetize notes tomorrow. You have to first get into the government.
Babul.
And the act of getting in may be the act which we describe as gambling.
Sandeep, thanks. I think Babul has it.
See, let me tell you something. India is running. India has been functioning as India for so many years now. अगर देश को चलाना है ना, if you just carry on, if you want to carry on in the manner it is carrying on, you can do so. You really do not need a prime minister who talks. India has proved that in the last 10 years. You can be a great husband. You can be quiet in the parliament and at home, and India will run. You will have someone else running it for you. But do you really want to make a change around you, a change that you would want to seek for yourself? If you want to do that, then you will have to show the conviction, the confidence, and the courage to face the flak and face the people who do not believe in you, to bring about the changes that India needs in the 21st century. So my plea to the people of the country is that be patient. We are walking the right direction, and they say that while you're walking the right direction, what you need to do is just keep walking. And the more, humsuffers that we get while we walk, instead of people who would just oppose for their political
Babul,
gains,
thanks.
political gains. I would just say, help us achieve this goal because that will be good for India.
Bubble, thanks. Question from the left.
I'm Sharoni. The proposition suggested that legitimacy and trust factor of a government is a higher priority than being just in power. So, isn't the maintenance of this legitimacy and this trust factor in itself a gamble?
Right.
As Ian mentioned, we recognise that governments must take risk when making difficult decisions. The outcome of those risks is more likely to be positive if the decision is taken with the trust of and the backing of the population who you govern in the first place. That's what lends you legitimacy, and that's what makes it less of a gamble and more of an acceptable risk.
Thanks, Tony. The second part of your question.
Right. To the opposition is that by suggesting that gambling itself is a necessity in the form of governance, is the opposition in any which way providing a cover for the under-evaluated, the poorly calculated, and as Dr. Sarkar had suggested earlier this evening, the disruptive acts which also fall under the umbrella term of gambling itself?
That was a long question. Thank you.
Any measure taken by the government which does not appear to have a black and white structure may appear to be a gamble to an external observer. Our point is you should allow governments to gamble even though the nuances of that step may not be apparent to all. Because the purpose of government is not just to govern like a stick in the mud prime minister. The purpose of government is to achieve change and to take it forward. If you do not achieve that change, you will be left with a situation where even something like same-sex relationships will be stuck in a law drafted in the 1870s. So you have to take that gamble to move with the times.
Thank you, Pradeep. Accepted.
Question to the proposition. So the proposition had to say that staying within the laws made by the government is important for the government itself. So in the case where the United States decided to hurt the sovereignty of Pakistan to extract a most wanted terrorist from the nation, who was clearly being harbored by Pakistan itself, was a wrong move in your opinion and was out of the law?
With regard to the capture of Osama bin Laden, from the United States perspective, it could be said that it represented a calculated risk on the part of the United States because they did infringe, in a sense, international law in order to go and capture bin Laden. But you may say that from the United States perspective as well, at least, that was a risk worth taking. What I am going to say is that they took a calculated risk. And you know what? Before they sent those troops into Abbottabad, what they didn't do was throw up their hands, say, "K Sarah, Sarah, life's a gamble," and just chuck them in at the deep end and see what happened. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. On that musical note, we come to the floor speeches. Now, what is the purpose of the floor speeches? I wish all of you had the time to speak and vent your thoughts. And speaking on behalf of the House, we have Mayuri Mukherjee.
Good evening, everyone. When this debate started, I was reminded of a very popular notion. If you ask a mathematician how much the value is of 2 plus 2, they'll say 4. But if you ask a debater, they'll say, how much do you want? That's how much 2 plus 2 is. And I think that's what side proposition was trying to do when they tried to play with semantics and bring gambling and governance to their side. But while I was being swayed by side opposition, I do think that when you have the whatever will be mindset, it does often come from a position of privilege. And it maybe reduces accountability, which is a very important factor for all governments to keep in mind. But similarly, my question to side proposition is that I think you have undermined how difficult it is often to be the face of a risk. So you have painted that the stakes only lie when your items are being gambled with, but often your stakes are also higher because you are the face of the risk that is being taken. But all said and done, I think, and also for demonetization or sanitization, whatever we call it, I think I'll agree with the quote that pre-8th of November, we had maybe 17 expert economists. Post 8th November, we have 1.7 billion expert economists here. Apart from that, I think this debate, both sides argued for the greater good, and that is my takeaway.
I think the greater good is something we should all strive for. And the inspirational message that I am left with is that unless we take a risk, we'll never know how far we can go, and that coming from a place of comfort, you can never win. So risks are always a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Moyuri. Moyuri has featured and performed extremely well in the intercollegiate debates that has happened this year. And on that note, CDC presents the last 3 minutes from Shommo Shekhar Ganguly. Shommo has been the International Inter-University CDC Champion of 2015. Shommo, 3 minutes of your critique on what you've had so far.
Good evening, Honorable Chairperson, sir. Well, there's a lot that is very unclear to the House, and initially I would like to start on the point that when we were talking about demonetization, we were talking about countries such as Burma, the Soviet Union, and North Korea, and then we had a sitting MP who said the boss is always right. So I'm really not sure which direction he was hinting at. But as far as the entire plethora of the argument today is being set up, we believe that the Titanic example was actually a very good one, because side proposition and opposition seems to believe that the Titanic has hit the iceberg and is going down, but they want to make sure that it is sailing in the right direction, failing to understand that there's only one direction that a sinking ship goes, and that's down. You see, risk and gamble happens to be, the semantics, as Mayuri rightly pointed out, can be debated. And the last speaker, Professor Mukherjee, did point out that capital markets are all about gambling, and that's true. The first ever capital market scheme was the Mississippi Company, which was set up, followed by the tulip bubble in Netherlands. And these were the first two instances when the world saw what a depression was all about, and lakhs of people were brought down to the streets because of this gambling in capital markets. Before that, there was economic growth, but there were never depressions. So I guess the gambling feature of the government is a significant portion which needed to be spoken of in great detail. And more importantly, I would also like to point out that in this particular debate, you see, again, the intentions might be very, very noble of the Prime Minister. But as Mr. Gupta himself pointed out, in case of a gamble, I think that point actually went against his whole argument, that you see, the government takes a gamble and the Prime Minister intends that everything is going to be good. But to give him back in the same coin, Neville Chamberlain wanted peace. Look what happened, right? And even though the Second World War might be seen as proving Hitler to be a very bad person, but the fact is millions of people did die, and that was a result of a gamble. Therefore, that should be kept in mind when this House votes tonight. Thank you so much, and I thank you for the time. Thank you.
Shommo, well analyzed, well analyzed. And as per debating convention, I request Dr. Shundeep Chatterjee to present his 3 minutes of summing up.
The argument of the proposition has been about skydiving. What they wanted to tell you was, if you check whether the parachute is intact and you jump out, that's good governance. If you don't check the parachute and jump out, that's gambling. It is our humble contention from this side of the floor that if you go skydiving and you don't check the parachute and you jump out, it's not gambling. It's an act, believe me, as a brain surgeon, I can tell you, it's an act that we call stupidity or suicide. And it only provides fodder for brain surgeons to operate on. It is our contention from this side of the floor that if you check the parachute and jump out, it is an act of gambling. If your parachute that gets entangled on the tall branches of a prickly tree, history will look upon it as a gamble. And if you land with your feet firmly on the ground with your parachute open, history will regard it as good governance. That is our contention from this side. The biggest problem with this proposition has been a very narrow-minded view of the word gambling. We've had a very narrow-minded approach to gambling from within the perimeter of the M25, so much so that they remind me of another gentleman who, with a very narrow-minded view of life, who I had encountered, who was also from within the perimeter of the M25, and I encountered him in the London Underground in the Central Line when I was going to give my FRCS exam in surgery. And he looked down upon me literally and figuratively and said to me, "You're from Calcutta. You must have difficulty conceiving of traveling in a train under the surface of the ground." And I said, no, actually, we have a metro in Calcutta. There was a silence for 3 tube stations, after which he asked, when did you get that metro? I said, 1984. He looked up as if for inspiration from the heavens, not realizing just above him was not the heavens but the London sewage system, and said to me, 1884 is when we got it in London, you know. I said, yes, I know. We couldn't afford to pay for 2 at that time. So, when our beloved Prime Minister on the 8th of November decided to take an action where all currency notes that showed the father of the nation on it would be abolished in 4 hours, everybody considers it an act of gambling. In 2 years' time, when we have the general elections, we will know whether that will be interpreted then as an act of good governance or an act of an act of gambling. That is our contention from this side.
Well, if that does not stir passions, what will? Ian.
Ladies and gentlemen, we on this side of the debate have taken a lot of stick, as we say in England, for being very narrow with our definition of the word risk and subsequently of gamble. But let me ask you this. If you use the opposition's definition of the word gamble, how do you criticize any decision that is made by a government, whether it's for good or for ill? What they've told you is that gambling is necessary. As Swati was saying, life is a gamble. Que sera, sera. You know, and Pradeep actually said, well, gambles always win in the end. So do you know what? When you're queuing at the ATM and you're really annoyed with the government, or they've done something else, maybe they've raised taxes, or they've made your life harder in some way, if you vote for the opposition, you cannot complain about that. You have no voice. Because if you vote for the opposition, you are saying gambling is fine. Doesn't matter if it works, doesn't matter if it doesn't. I mean, Pradeep was even saying that Neville Chamberlain in 1938 took a gamble, and you know, it kind of didn't work in the short term, but in the long term it was all right after 40 million people had been killed. And that is the kind of attitude that you would have to live with and would have to adopt if you support the opposition tonight. Thank you.
On that note, your hour has come. You've heard the primary speeches, you've heard the interjections, you've heard the summing up. So, members of the House, in your opinion, we believed at the beginning that governments should govern and not gamble. So those of you who believe that this motion has been defeated, those of you who believe that my friends on my left-hand side, the opposition led by Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee, has managed to convince you, put your right hands up. Thank you. And now, those of you who believe to the contrary, those of you who believe in the motion, those of you who believe that my friends on my right-hand side, led by Ian, believe that governments should govern and not gamble, put your right hand up. I have a feeling by a thin majority, the motion has been carried. Thank you very much.